Hi folks, this is Mrs. Brown here from Research Triangle High School, and the purpose of this presentation is to talk a little bit about the use of symbolism in the novel All Quiet on the Western Front. One of the first symbols that we see in the novel is the boots that Kemerick is wearing when he dies. And if you'll notice, these books go in sequence to each man, and as each person who gets the boots becomes the next death out of this small group of schoolboys. And this becomes an example of foreshadowing. As you know, the next person to get the boots is the next person to die. We see them go through 4 different men and see 4 different deaths. They represent some of the practicality that the men have to deal with in war, over sentimentality. Even as Kemerick is dying, he's lost a leg, and they're looking at them saying, what use are the boots to Kemerick? There's no point in some random orderly getting these. Kemerick would rather his friends had them and someone who could make good use of them. And it kind of shows how the war has broken down some of these more social niceties and become all about the practicalities of survival. And it also shows the connections between these boys as each one of them in turn passes on the boots to the next person. The next symbol that we see are the horses, and the horses show up in a couple different places, but a lot of what they represent is this idea of the conflict between this old style of warfare, almost a Renaissance medieval type things where all of the men are on the horses with their swords and one line charges forward to the other line and then the enemies meet in the middle, to this new technologies that have really changed the way war happens. They also demonstrate some of the brutality of the war. The horses that are wounded and injured and trapped out in no man's land have this cry that sounds like men, and it drives the guys in the trenches crazy, having to listen to this anguish sound over and over again. And the horses, very much like the men, are sort of trapped in this situation that they didn't make for themselves, and they're just used up, and there's nothing that you can really do to save them. Now, usually in literature, butterflies are archetypes that mean some sort of change or metamorphosis. When we see the way Remarque uses them, though, they do represent this idea of innocence and joy of nature, but they're so fragile, and they seem so incongruous with the rest of this scenery of the brutality and the complete destruction of war. And here's these tiny little butterfly wings and these beautiful light creatures that Paul sees. And it's kind of this idea that, like the boy's innocence, they really don't belong and can't survive out here in this environment. Throughout the whole novel, the boys have been talking about, or have had other people talking to them about, the Kaiser. You know, this is the person that they're supposed to have all of their honor for, the leader of their country, the person that they're fighting for. And when he finally shows up, they're really unimpressed with him. He seems a little small, he seems really unimportant, he's really just an ordinary man. And it kind of drives home the pointlessness of this particular war, that all of these kids are dying by the millions, really for the decisions of about 30 men on either side. Early on in the novel, there's this scene where Kat and Paul are out doing something and they hear this cackle of geese. They hear this sound, and Kat has this kind of sixth sense, and this goose represents this idea that Kat is always able to survive and to find his way through. And he hears this sort of thing, and Paul and Kat don't even have to speak. They just sort of look at each other, and they know that they're going to sneak back later on that night, catch the goose, cook it, and have this little dinner, just the two of them, almost this communal sort of moment. And it's this camaraderie that builds up between the men, that they don't really need to talk, that they can bond over the simplest thing as just having some real food. And none of the other guys are there for this particular moment to just show that the special bond that Paul and Kat have in this middle of this horrible situation. Now, I'm going to group the next couple of things together. That's the Russian soldiers, the Russian prisoners of war, kind of as a unit, and Gerard Duval, even though they take place at different points in the book. But both of them represent, is particularly for Paul, this idea of the human face of war. How when he's not fighting and he's actually meeting somebody face to face, he makes these connections with the fellow men. He sees the Russian soldiers up close, he sees Gerard Duval up close, and realizes that this concept that Remarque says at the very beginning, that war is possible only in the abstraction. So just like when we saw Paul make eye contact with a man and he couldn't throw the grenade, this idea that the enemy is just another guy. They're really just people like you, and the only reason that you're fighting against them is because they're on the other side of whatever dividing line your superiors have decided. In the chapter where Paul returns back home on leave, we have this moment when he's back in his old bedroom. And this is not an uncommon theme in literature with people who go back to their childhood homes, but he really feels lost. He's looking around the room as though it belonged to somebody else entirely, and in many ways it did. He looks at his old books and he thinks about all the dreams and all the things that plans that he thought he would have for his life, and he realizes that this is all lost. And this is part of this concept of Paul and his friends being part of the lost generation, that whatever life they had imagined for themselves can't ever really happen because of what the war has done to them, and the way that it's disconnected him from his old dreams and hopes and from his own youth and past. Now, the term iron youth is used several times in the novel and was, used throughout Germany, was supposed to describe these young men who were going to be this unbreakable group that was going to serve for the glory of their country and bring honor to their country and to their Kaiser. And as Remarque says in Paul talking about the first set of shelling, says, "The first bombardment showed us our mistake, and under it, the world as they had taught it to us broke to pieces." So this idea that they are not nearly as iron strong as they had been promised that they would be, that they really are human, and that there are parts of them that will break and shatter under the war conditions. In the scene where the men are someplace in France there on the line, and they see these girls across the river, and they have to cross the river in order to go meet these French women. And this river becomes then this barrier that they have to cross between everything behind them, which is the war, and the comfort of the women on the other side. So it becomes almost a baptism. They have to take off their clothes because they don't want their things to get wet. They hold all their packages on top of their head as they go across. And it's like washing away all of the stuff that's behind them from the war to go in and have this short chapter of some comfort with these women. And it's this idea of the lives that they might have had back home. And the river becomes this separation between what might have been and what they're actually dealing with and the reality of their wartime situation. Another symbol in the novel is the movie poster that they see. They're out on a patrol and they come across this, just like you might see any place downtown, there's a poster that's just been up on a pole. And they're looking at this, and it's a poster of a pretty girl dancing with a handsome young man. And they realize that this could have been them, that this is the life they might have had, that they might have been dressed up and taking out some beautiful young girl on a date and an evening. But this girl seems unreal to them. She's so pretty and so clean, and this whole idea is so unreachable that it makes them feel dirty. They recognize how long it's been since they were cleaned up because they've just been out there fighting this war and with the guys. And they actually make a trip to the delousing station to get the chemical treatment to get rid of the lice. And it becomes this symbol of what they've lost and the life that they might have had and how far away they are from that particular dream. Which brings us to the final symbol that I want to talk about in this presentation, and that's women in the novel. Obviously, this is a war book, and we're following the regiment and the men, but the women who do show up, we see Paul's mother, we see the French girls, we see some of the nurses, and some of the men talk about the wives back home. All of them represent some sort of comfort, the idea of something that would nurture them, either physical comfort, emotional comfort, but something that would reach out to them in some way. And even in the case of Paul's mother, who is sick and dying, it's still this idea of the women will provide this safe landing place for the men. And there you have some of the major symbols in the novel All Quiet on the Western Front. And that's it. Good night.